Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome to another episode of American Medieval. I'm, of course, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I am excited to be joined by Kathleen Duval today. Kathleen is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Native Nations, A Millennium in North America, as well as Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. She teaches in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but she's also written for The Atlantic, Time Magazine, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. And she was also in the recent Ken Burns film, The American Revolution, which I hear kind of people had been talking a little bit about recently. So we'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, welcome, Kathleen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. Well, we'll see at the end if you're actually stating that or not. So everybody says that, and nobody's run away screaming yet. So, I'll try to keep my streak up. So anyway, before we talk about, kind of more serious topics, though, is that I hope you'll indulge me, is that on American Medieval, I like to start with what might seem like kind of a silly question. And the silly question involves time machines, because to my mind, I think anybody who studies the past, historians especially, we have to confront time machines. At some point, somebody's going to ask us about time machines. My question's a little bit different. So let's imagine we have a single-use time machine, importantly there and back, so you don't have to stay anywhere. So you get to come back. But the caveat is that the time machine has been presented to you, Kathleen, with the restriction that you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself, a childhood Kathleen, that you will someday grow up to study the native peoples of America and be a history professor. Yeah. How does young Kathleen react to that news?
I think I'm imagining myself going back to my 6-year-old self, because it was the bicentennial of the American Revolution. And I think that is the first time I really started to think about history. And we piled into my parents' Chevrolet, and I remember my parents put blankets down in the footwell so that we just had a giant bed back there, and we bounced around because, of course, we didn't have seatbelts. And I think I would have, thought studying history must be a giant adventure where you get to drive across the country and learn cool stuff and eat more junk food than your parents usually let you eat. And I think I would have thought that was pretty amazing. And I'll also say, since you asked about being a professor, my dad was a professor, and I think my whole life I just thought, he's home a lot. He doesn't seem to work that hard. He talks about his students, and it just sounds like he's having fun with them. So I think I also would have thought being a professor would be like both the cushiest and the most fun job I could imagine.
Okay. I mean, you're describing basically my life as a tenured professor already as a 6-year-old self. Like, I'm basically just driving around, laying on the floor of the car, eating junk food kind of all the time.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, it's just amazing. Like, you were just like a prophet there, just looking forward into the future.
Yeah. I was very clear-eyed. As a 6-year-old.
My mom was an American history high school teacher, high school and middle school teacher as well. And so I absolutely sympathize with, I had a number of siblings, and I used to get, because I was the eldest, I used to get the kind of secret third seat in the kind of trunk of the car whenever she was dragging us all up and down the East Coast with my dad, and the whole family going to Civil War battlefields.
Oh, wow.
So this makes perfect sense, right? Like, there was always kind of pancakes in the morning. We would set up a pancake house. And then Civil War battlefield somewhere.
Which, oddly enough, Civil War battlefields are a lovely place to run around as a child, which is
absolutely
so horrible and war-drenched, right? But they're these lovely fields.
But they're giant, lovely fields, exactly.
Right.
Like, they're kind of verdant and beautiful and big open spaces.
That's right, yeah.
God bless the National Park Service.
Yes, absolutely.
Generally. So was there something that's kind of later on, sent you into a particular direction? So you said, as a child, interested in history, have some experience kind of growing up around academia because of your dad. But then you decided at some point to study kind of native peoples, specifically early America, kind of more generally. Was that always kind of an interest? You mentioned the bicentennial, so maybe it has been, but maybe there was something else.
I mean, in a weird way, I think, I grew up in Arkansas.
Okay.
And so in 1970s, I'm not that old, in 1976, when we went to see history, when we went to see revolutionary history, we drove east, right? We went to Philadelphia, we went to Williamsburg. That history wasn't something that I thought took place where I was from. And so, I wouldn't have imagined being a historian of Arkansas in the middle of the continent. But when I went to grad school, I was sort of fishing around for an idea. I knew I wanted to do early American history. I knew Native American history would be part of that. It'd be European and African and Native. And I started thinking about the place that I was from. And I knew that there had been French and Spanish colonization there. And I could read a little French and a little Spanish. And I thought, well, maybe I'll see if there are any documents from the French and the Spanish when they were in Arkansas in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it turns out there are. They maniacally wrote things down. And so there are wonderful documents. And one of the things I found out is that there were very few Europeans actually there. So there was an Arkansas post right next to the Mississippi River in what's now Arkansas. And there would be, say, a French official there, and he'd have maybe 9 soldiers and a couple of traders. And then there'd be like 10,000 Quapaw Indians living around him, right? And he was on their land, and he knew it, and they knew it, and he was useful to them. It was useful to them to have a permanent sort of trading partner in the French, and then later with the Spanish. And that just threw me for a loop. I thought, I didn't even know there was a colonial history here that I could tell, that I could find out enough about to write about. And here, not only is that true, but it is not a history of colonizers. It is a history of the native people of this region. And so that's what I wrote my dissertation on. And it kind of grew from there. And over time, Native history it's always been part of what I do, but then just getting to know Native students and Native colleagues and other people working in Native history, but also in Native issues today, that has all sort of gradually become part of what's important to me as a scholar, as well as a person.
Yeah, and I think that one of the, a couple of things there is that one, I'm thinking about my own kind of experiences growing up. I mentioned kind of having a high school American history teacher, and so I grew up in the Northeast, and so like the narrative of kind of early America there was heavily reliant on the Puritans, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and stuff like that. And then my child, who's now in college, going through public schools in Virginia, everything is Jamestown, right? And stuff like that. And so, talking with students too, I'm very interested, teaching here at Virginia Tech about the people from all over the country and how narratives about kind of different American foundings. And like everybody thinks that there's history where you are, but nobody thinks like it's necessarily important history because we have all these other kind of founding myths, and it's about kind of the beginning. And that really opened my eyes, like going through, my son's public schooling and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In Arkansas, early American history was New England and Virginia.
Yeah.
Right. It's only later that I thought, wait a second, I'm pretty sure something was happening here too.
Yeah, there's other stuff there. The other thing that you mentioned too is about connecting kind of early American history to today. Because you start off, of course, Native nations, talking about Standing Rock and protest pipelines. And I think that's something that's really important oftentimes for people who aren't very familiar with Native history, is to remember that there are still lots of Native Americans here, and they have direct connections kind of into the past. And, have you found that that's been kind of a like when you're teaching this stuff, and obviously Native students will have a different perspective, right? But the vast majority, at least at my institution, are predominantly white students who don't have those kinds of connections and have a very kind of colonial-centric, narrative about early America. So I'm curious, how have students kind of reacted to that? Or does that help them in some way to see those kinds of lines of continuity, or does it kind of upend expectations?
So when I first got to UNC, where I teach, my very first semester I was assigned to teach our Native North America class. And, I was an early Americanist. I was hired as an early Americanist. And so I was assigned to teach in one semester a class that basically goes from, the beginning of time, or as close as we can get to that right now. I'm a little facetious there, but to today. And for one thing, I was not qualified to do that. And I have gotten better over time, and I've learned a lot more. But also, I thought, when I first started, I thought, well, this is doing a disservice to Native history. It shouldn't all be wedged into one semester. We should at least have 2 semesters where we get to explore the long, centuries long, if not millennia long, history of Native North America. But I've changed my mind about that. I've realized that it is a tremendously wonderful thing for a student, a non-Native student who knows nothing, little to nothing about Native history or the Native present, to start kind of at the beginning and to learn, a little bit at least about those millennia before Europeans got here, to then also learn about the centuries of contact between Europeans and Native Americans, starting in the 1500s, 1600s, in which Native Americans were still most of the population on the continent. And then also not to leave that class without learning that Native nations are still here today and that these things are all connected. And I think over time, as I've been teaching, I've been better about working lessons about today and teaching them about today in all of the weeks of the class. But even in that first semester, when it was definitely a rough draft of a class, they still left knowing, we had Native speakers in the class, but also just, knowing that Native nations are still around.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I'm thinking about kind of my own trajectory, and it mirrors kind of yours as well, is that I was so afraid of talking about that quote unquote relevance issue, or kind of the connection of something in the far distant past. Yeah. In my case, medieval Europe, oftentimes when I'm teaching about that, but then something to today. And then as my teaching has developed, and I think I've become kind of a better teacher, like it just kind of more naturally comes out. The students respond to it, and it helps them understand the past better oftentimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's really easy. And maybe it's the right thing to do when you're first starting out. But yeah, to think it's presentist. It is what we think about things today will too much influence how we study the past and won't let us study the past on its own terms. But we know we can't do that anyway. That's not, we are always our 21st century selves, even as we're looking at the past. And then we also just still really try to take the past on its own terms. And I think maybe it's a skill we develop over time, but certainly we are capable of doing both things, of doing justice to the past, while also understanding that some of the ways that the past is important and appealing, interesting, have to do with today and today's questions.
Yeah, and that's, the interesting part I think is really important too, right? There's plenty of students in our classes or who buy our books or whatever, right, who are doing it for some other reason, right? Like they feel that they need to do it. It's a requirement of some, major or, breadth requirement or something like that in class. But the vast majority of students, at least, in my experience, like they could have chosen other courses.
That's right.
Right? They could have bought another book, but they've decided to, or watched another TV show or, or documentary, but like they've decided on that because there's something that piqued their interest. And so it never seemed wrong to me to kind of try to at least kind of meet them there and say like, okay, like what are you interested in? And like, how can we tell, as you said, kind of a better, more interesting and truer story about the past, but like without being kind of, an old fuddy-duddy with yellowed notes standing up there and just droning on for an hour. So exactly. I have taken those classes. I've probably done that to my students too. Let's be fair.
I am sure you have not. Yeah. I am 100% sure.
No. But I do want to talk about the ancient past, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Because, of course, the focus of the podcast is generally on the Middle Ages, but the whole thing is about kind of how do the Middle Ages kind of resonate within the United States. And so that's oftentimes it's medievalists who are working here in the United States. How do students kind of react to that? How do the popular publics kind of resonate that? But one of the things I do like to remind our audience is that there were people living here too in North America at that time. Something you emphasize, to great effect, I think, in Native nations as well. Sorry, I'm gesturing. Nobody can see this, of course, because it's all audio, but I'm gesturing at your book, which is sitting right next to me, as if anybody can see what's going on. I will get used to a podcast. I swear to, like, year 2, year 3, I will get used to a podcast. Anyway, so there were, lots of Native peoples here, like vast populations. And so one of the ways, the way you start your book is with kind of cities. Because again, that's oftentimes not at all kind of what people think about there. So could you just kind of talk about Native cities? You have kind of 3 big examples that you use there. If you want to focus on that, that's fine. But just like, what was kind of Native North America like in this period that we generally think of as the Middle Ages?
Yeah, so one of the things I really want to do in this book is show change over time. So I decided to start the book 1,000 years ago or so, because I not only wanted to show North America before Europeans and Africans got here, but also show that it changed before Europeans and others got here. And I was talking with some of my colleagues, including a former guest on your show, Brett Whalen, about the way medieval history is presented in world history. And one of the things that we've noticed is that if you look at, say, a world history textbook, the medieval era might, if it glances at North America, it might mention the Aztecs, right? You might get to Mexico City, but none of the rest. Like, I think world history textbook authors have not really known what to do with North America.
Yeah.
And so as we were talking about that, I actually started reading that part of some world history textbooks, which I had never done before, and realizing there were a lot of parallels, and that now if I were writing a world history textbook, I mean, if I were talking to somebody who's writing a world history textbook, I could tell them how to fit it in, that North America really does fit in ways. So about 1,000 years ago was the rise, North America saw the rise of really quite large cities, at least large cities sort of similar in size to at least some parts of Western Europe and other parts of the world, what would have been considered large cities at the time. And this is made possible by the spread of large-scale agriculture. That's something that's spreading in other parts of the world, sort of on a parallel track at sort of somewhat similar times, and particularly in the time known to climatologists as the medieval warm era. Generally, some parts of the world, including what's now the United States, was experiencing a time of longer growing periods, slightly warmer weather, all of which is good for agriculture. And there had been corn grown in what's now the United States for a long time, but it expanded and made possible the growth of cities. So there were cities that arose in different parts of North America. The biggest and most well-known was Cahokia, what's called Cahokia. Its ruins still are where it was, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. It had a central city of at least 10,000 people, and then large population, sort of rural population and sort of suburban population right around the city, and then several satellite cities that were almost as large on both sides of the Mississippi River. There was a large civilization, several different large civilizations in what's now the American Southwest. And then in the book, I also talk about Moundville, which was a city in what's now Alabama that was influenced by Cahokia. And so these are all places with fairly large populations for the time, fairly urbanized, with what it seems like, and there's some variation, but what it seems like were very strong political and religious leaders, but certainly places that Europeans of the time would recognize as cities with large populations.
Yeah. What's interesting, too, is that, as we were saying, and I think this is probably important, too, is that, cities require not just, large-scale agricultural production because, as you point out in the book and as other people have written, right, is that, the work that's done within a city is not devoted to agriculture. So you need other people to kind of feed them. And that allows kind of concentration, but also, political and kind of cultural centralization as well. So one of the things that, you talk about with Moundsville, you just mentioned, right, is that it was influenced by Cahokia. So it's not just the fact that it's a city, right? Like it's a city that is kind of pressing outwards kind of politically and culturally, right? Like, and how they directly influence Moundville, like it seems to be a little bit unclear. Is that fair? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. It's sort of archaeologists kind of guess at it. How would it have happened? Are there emissaries that go out, kind of like missionaries, trying to convince other people to do the same thing? Are there people from other places who come and they've heard of this place and they come and try to figure out what it's like and take some parts of it back home? But in one way or another, Cahokia just influences societies all across mid-America. But then there are also parallel developments going on, certainly in the Southwest. It's clear the leadership structure must be able to muster large amounts of labor to build, in the Southwest, certainly to build huge irrigation projects. And the urban development is really quite astounding and unknown to most people. Yeah.
And most of this is known through archaeological evidence. Is that correct?
It is. That's right. Though there's also some oral history. So the oral history, I knew there was some oral history. I didn't know how directly it would speak to what happened. The purpose of oral history is generally not to tell exactly what happened, right? It is often about sort of it has its own present purposes, right? To tell the people of the present how to live and how they got to be who they are. But one of the things I sort of discovered when I was doing my research is that there actually is quite a bit of oral history across very different societies, different cultures across the continent that talks about The cities themselves a little bit, but in the context of the fall of those cities. So Cahokia and other civilizations of the same time that were urbanized, centralized, they fell around the time that the medieval warm period changed into the Little Ice Age. And archaeology shows that these cities were abandoned, that people lived more spread out on more spread out farms and smaller towns. But then there's an awful lot of oral history that also talks about why those cities fell and why what came later, indeed, they tend to say was better, that living more decentralized was more sort of sustainable. It was less likely to result in famine. They talk about diversifying their economies. Interestingly, living off of, yes, agriculture continuing, but also more hunting and more gathering. So there's a sort of stereotype of primitive native peoples just hunting and gathering. In fact, they seem to have, and they talk about this in their own histories, hunted and gathered more than their urban ancestors would have, in part to try to prevent famine, to really diversify their food sources.
Yeah. Is this a moment in which we're running into a kind of Eurocentric or, for lack of a better term, and this is not the right term, kind of a Western understanding of kind of historical development, right? In which we think that urbanization is more civilized in a certain way. And the native experiences, or at least through oral histories and archaeology, sources are problematic in all sorts of different ways, written sources no less so than anything else. But it's kind of rejecting that, or at least kind of pushing back against that and saying, like, this is a different way of living and it was better for us.
Yeah, that's right. We are so, you study this, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to even talk about sort of Western thought in the medieval era to somebody who knows so much more about it than I do.
I don't know what I'm doing, so please go ahead. Yeah.
But we are so immersed in that assumption, even if on the top of our minds we think it isn't quite right. Deep in us is this belief that they're primitive people, they advance over time, they may be hunter-gatherers at the beginning, they discover, develop agriculture, eventually they build cities, they for a time have to perhaps have a king, and then they discover democracy, right? And that is actually not the way North America developed. I'm sure there were developments before 1,000 years ago, many different things changed. But 1,000 years ago, there were great cities that had very powerful king-like leaders that depended mostly on agriculture. And then there was a period after that, and I called it a fall, but the oral histories actually talk about it as something better. A period of, right, as we just talked about, more hunting and gathering, but also a democratization of the oral histories almost universally that talk about this period, talk about bringing down powerful leaders who'd gotten too full of themselves, who'd made promises they couldn't keep, and creating new political structures, not only that were more democratic, brought in more people and brought in more people's voices, but also were designed to try to prevent ever again somebody rising and taking that much power. And they saw that, and I think our 21st century selves might agree, right? That's a better way, that democracy is better than monarchy, right? We might or might not, right? But so I have to tell this to a medievalist. Sometimes people will listen to what I tell about Native history and they say, and then eventually they'll say something like, but they didn't discover the wheel. And I'll be like,
oh my God.
But that's not wheels are amazing. I'm so glad we have them. But if, for one thing, if you don't have a horse or an ox, then, they didn't have those kinds of large mammals, a wheel is going to be a lot less useful. And to say nothing of a combustion engine, right?
Yeah.
But is a wheelbarrow better than having your dog pull a sled? I don't know, maybe, but it's not. The wheel is not a set point in the advancement of humankind. And yet I think a lot of us kind of have to convince ourselves that it's not, because it is what we sort of think.
I'm tempted to go into a rant about political scientists and international development theory right now, but I'm going to hold off on that, right, for the sake of everyone, all of the listeners and yourself included. But just to say, this absolutely makes sense, and it's really interesting too, like the parallels with what you're saying, like what I experience, and many of my colleagues, of course, trying to talk about the medieval world is just, things were like this, therefore they were worse. It was just like, okay, they were different, 100%. They were different than what came before. They were different than what's after. For some people, that was worse. For other people, it might have been better. And for other people, it just might have been different. Like it was just that we don't need to attach a moral value judgment.
Yes,
But
right.
the other thing too, like about the wheel, which is just so frustrating, is just thinking about the conditions in which a wheel is useful.
Yes,
Like you
that's
said,
right.
like having large pack animals makes the wheel useful. If you don't have large pack animals and you don't structure your society around that, like why do you need a wheel? Like you just don't. Like it's not going to help, right?
Yeah, it's not going to help. Yeah. And something that's really telling is that Native Americans didn't widely adopt the wheel when it became available.
Yeah.
You know what they did adopt? Guns, because those are really useful.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah.
But I should say, since I said that, they also continued to use bows and arrows and for certain things where bows and arrows were more useful.
And that's the other kind of part of that too, is like this encounter with Europeans and Africans, of course, as well, enslaved Africans. The nice thing, or one of the great things that, the book does is it breaks down this kind of, again, this too simplistic narrative is that the natives encountered Europeans and then they just kind of rolled over. There was nobody there, like the population had been decimated, and then all of a sudden, like it's Europe land, kind of all of a sudden. And it wasn't even like two contemporaries, they didn't even think that, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The encounter is just so much more complicated.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So where does this, because this is a myth that like I had in my head, I remember kind of thinking that until I started actually reading about it, is like, where does this idea of kind of the depopulated North American continent, or Americas generally, like where does that kind of come from?
Yeah. So let me talk about that at sort of two different levels. You make such a good point there, Matt, that Europeans in the 1500s and 1600s who came to North America, they might have thought they were better than Native people, and most of them did. And most people through most time have thought they are better than other kinds of people, right? That's what we tend to think.
Sure.
But they didn't think Native nations were unimportant or unorganized or unpopulated. They recognized that the word nation is a European word that Europeans use for Native people when they first get here. They can recognize these are polities and it's their land. And then Europeans have all kinds of ways of telling themselves that it should be their land and convincing themselves of that. But they don't think it's not. They don't think those people aren't there and don't matter. A little bit of that depopulation comes from there were early ships, Spanish ships, that begin to sail up from the early Spanish colonies in the Caribbean in the early 1500s, and maybe even before that, but that are stealing people. So they will sail to the coast, row to shore, get some people to come up, and then grab some people, put them back on the boat, get them on the ship, and enslave them. All right. And those people never return. Sometimes they actually do return, but usually they don't return. And then when the English start to come and do some of the beginning of settler colonialism that the English do, and there is a movement of peoples sort of away from the Atlantic coast, just away from the very coast, like a little bit deeper inland, just to kind of avoid that kind of attack. And some of it is permanent, and some of it maybe even just be temporary, people who just clear out when they see somebody coming. And so there are these accounts where sometimes Europeans they'll have the account of an explorer who came before them, or they even themselves will have been there before, and they sail up and they're like, nobody lives here anymore. Well, they're avoiding you, dude.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Which isn't to say that there weren't some times where disease was a factor, but it does not depopulate the continent or anything close to it. Then the real myth comes in the 19th century.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things I really wanted to do in Native Nations is to slow this down, to say, okay, the colonization of the continent does not happen in the 1500s or the 1600s or the 1700s. It happens in the 1800s. And in the middle of the continent, it doesn't happen to the second half of the 1800s, second half of the 19th century.
Yeah.
But while white Americans, people from the United States are moving west, are making the continent into part of the United States and either kicking Native people off of their land or confining them to reservations, they start to tell themselves these myths that there's some earlier threads they're pulling on, but the full weight of the myth is created in the 19th century. And when you start to look at the pieces of the myth, it all makes sense that this would make them feel better about themselves. That would make them feel like God was on their side, right? Yeah. That Native people were not that organized. There were not that many of them. They were dying off already anyway. And also that they were never using the land right. So some of the myth, not only that there were never cities, but that they never even farmed, right? And it's amazing how 19th century Americans can see Native women's fields and still call them pure hunters and gatherers, that they don't farm. They just it's so self-serving, right? Because I think Europeans and European Americans in the 19th century and earlier, if you farm, you really have established that you own this place, right? And if you can say Native people don't farm, then, they just kind of live lightly on the land. They ride across it on their horses. They hunt some deer. They don't really own the land, and therefore we can take it. It can be ours.
Yeah, again, these kind of narratives of kind of quote unquote, and I want to be clear, quote unquote, natural kind of civilization, right? Is that, if you paint the person you're stealing from and enslaving and oppressing as somehow less civilized, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can go back to kind of Aristotle and, stuff like that, natural slavery. But it makes sense. And I want to say too, before we move on, is that like someday I will write, when I'm at the end of my career, which is not that far off in the horizon, but I'm going to write my book about why I hate the 19th century for all the historiographical myths that it is still like stuck in all of our brains.
I guess, yeah. So, on what you work on, there must be tons that originates there, right?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. So because again, in some of the same ways, right? Like in the European context, even dealing with the development of polities within Europe, but also things like the Crusades, like the colonial kind of civilizational kind of project used medieval history oftentimes as kind of a crutch, a justification for kind of what's going on. French people are like this because of this that happened in the Middle Ages. Our colonies in North Africa, in the Middle East, are deserved because we are recreating what we were doing in the 12th century. Like this is extraordinarily explicit in English, German, and French historiography. And so, it seems, kind of oftentimes similar is that, the real project of expansion, as you were saying, like is happening there, and it's happening across the Atlantic as well.
Right. Yeah. That dang 19th century.
That dang 19th century. I always run into problems when I say this to Americanists, I have to say, because they're like, well, hey now, you're kind of right, but like still our turf, like stay back in the 12th century, medievalists there, which fair enough. I wouldn't say in the 12th century, but anyway. Although I'm very tall in real life, I still love the podcast Tiny Matters, another podcast in the Multitude Podcast Collective. Tiny Matters talks about how science shapes every facet of our lives, and especially how tiny things, from molecules to microbes, can have a big and often surprising impact on society, both past and present. Former scientists Sam Jones and Debaki Chakravarti will lead you through the answers to some of your burning questions, such as, can we resurrect an extinct species? And if so, should we? We've all seen Jurassic Park, right? Anyway, find out more. Tiny Matters is sponsored by the American Chemical Society, a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C., and produced by Multitude. New episodes every Wednesday, wherever you listen to podcasts. If I could kind of change directions just a little bit here, I mean, this is really interesting and I want to come back to it. But one of the things that really struck me in the book, and then you were kind of mentioning, is that these large civilizations in the Southwest, the American Southwest, which again, kind of, you were talking about Arkansas, I was talking about growing up in the Northeast, like just did not hear about like at all, like just did not exist. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of what those communities were like and kind of what do we know about them?
Yeah. So there are several different ones, but the one I want to write about in the book is the Hahugum of what's now sort of southern Arizona and northern Sonora, the Mexican state of Sonora. They were a large and urbanized civilization around the year 1100, let's say. Multiple cities of 10,000 plus people.
Wow.
Yeah. Trade networks among them, of course, but also between them and other civilizations in the American Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. And what it seems like over time, and both the archaeology and the oral history suggests this, is that they're sort of flourishing for a long time with very large-scale irrigation projects that people today, sort of even struggle to figure out exactly how they work. So that the engineering is just amazing.
Yeah.
If you go around Phoenix today, you can still see bits of them, like some of the trenches that are left. They don't look nearly as impressive as they would have if they actually were still filled with water and still working. But I Perhaps as things moved into the Little Ice Age, or at least the sort of the century before the Little Ice Age, there's increased drought and increased sort of flooding. It's clear that these irrigation systems, which were huge, had multiple problems, and like every season were having to be sort of revamped. And then what the oral history says is that there comes a period when the people sort of rise up against their leaders who haven't been able to like live up to their promises of controlling the weather. Like one of the things that they were doing was saying they could control the weather, and when the weather gets worse, a lot of their source of power is diminished. And so, as in other parts of the continent, the Hahagum's descendants spread out, and they are the Otham today, the Otham peoples today of the same region. They still have large, relatively large irrigation projects. Even after the fall of the largest cities, they're still huge farmers, but they develop the kind of diversified economy they develop there is one where some of the Otham stay river people. And so they continue to farm on the rivers of the Southwest with irrigation projects. But then some of the Otham become desert Otham, and they actually live out in the Sonoran Desert and they reap the bounty. As it turns out, I've learned a lot about the desert as I was working on this project of the Sonoran Desert. Yeah. The Sonoran Desert is one of the few deserts in the world that gets it has 2 seasonal rains, and that really affects the kinds of plants and edible plants and medicinal plants that it has. And so these desert Otham who were experts in the things you could eat, et cetera, from the desert. And then they traded with the river Otham. And so that was part of diversifying their economy, that there were, in bad years, maybe they could eat some more of the products of the desert. In good agricultural years, the river Otham would have plenty to share and to trade. And that's something that continues into the 19th and 20th centuries. And then there's still parts of it today. There are many Otham farmers today, even after having had the rivers dammed and losing a lot of their water, in addition to losing their land. After the Civil War, U.S. travelers start to come across the continent in fairly large numbers. They are repeatedly not only fed by the Otham, but write letters and journals in which they say, we were riding across the desert and suddenly we came to this giant place of green and beauty and plenty where they would feed us as much as we wanted. And this is an agricultural economy that began more than 1,000 years ago and still continues today in the desert. It's kind of amazing.
The environment seems to be kind of like a player here, right? Like, I mean, it's always a player, right? All kind of, histories, of course. I'm saying banal things now, but especially kind of in the what you're describing about the way that these cities need the environment to be a certain way in order to develop. And then when the climate changes significantly and the environment shifts, then living in a city doesn't make sense anymore. Sometimes kind of economically, sometimes culturally, sometimes politically. Right. Because also you talk about too, like the encounter of kind of Spanish kind of moving up north from Mexico as well, kind of encountering the remnants of these older cities and not kind of knowing kind of kind of knowing what to do with them, but also like not being sure about like, is this still a place that has these types of centralized kind of populations?
Yeah, right. So they came across still very large populations, but more spread out into smaller towns. And then they would see these giant ruins and they would say, who built these? And this happens in all parts of the Americas. Like, who built these? It couldn't have been these primitive people we see here. And of course, the people are like, well, okay, 1, we're not primitive. And 2, our ancestors totally built those. So over and over, these accounts will just have all these theories about who might have built them. When the people who built them or their descendants are right there.
And I think the other thing too is that it seems to remind me too, and I think your book does a really good job, is that like these native peoples were everywhere in the places that we call the United States, right? Like, again, and that this goes back to kind of maybe just kind of my regional upbringing is thinking about like, okay, here, but not over there, not, in the rest of the country or something like that. But it seems like that these types of civilizations, although you give, kind of 3, is that there are others, and there's, of course, other peoples kind of doing things in this period, all over in the Pacific Northwest, Midwest, Southwest, Southeast and stuff like that.
Yeah, so. That's right. And there aren't large urban civilizations everywhere, but they are in many, many places. Yeah. And as you say, there are people everywhere.
Yeah. And connected too. I mean, that's what's always stunning is again, kind of a similarity. I'm just bringing from my own experience to medieval Europe is that you see trade goods moving across vast distances in these places, right? So
yeah, absolutely. There are huge trade networks that span North America. And we don't know, were there traders who crossed the continent, or is it sort of point-to-point trade and one place would trade for more of the exotic good than they needed and then trade some of it on to their trading partner who's sort of next down the line. But we know archaeologists have found, like seashells very far from the ocean and, mica from North Carolina all over the continent. And same thing with copper from the Great Lakes. And so there were these long distance trade networks. And there's some evidence that the amount of trade goods that traded increased after the fall of the cities, that trade also was part of the sort of diversifying the economy or making a more sort of reliable set of different ways to feed your people and get things to your people.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned kind of before is that like people aren't sure, if I'm understanding you correctly, that if there's long distance traders or if it's kind of a point-to-point system.
Yeah, that's right.
But there's always people, like goods don't move by themselves,
exactly
right?
Right. Whether it's one person or multiple
moving,
people. Exactly.
Right?
Exactly
So.
Right. And so obviously in most, the river system of North America is incredible. And so lots of it happened on rivers, or, you might take goods in the downstream direction on boats and then walk along a trail on the way back. But then when like Coronado comes to explore the Southwest and wants to go across the, what he doesn't really know it's there, right? But eventually goes across the plains and makes it as far. He walks up from Mexico and gets as far as present day, maybe Nebraska. That again, like he doesn't do that by himself. Like right. There are Native people with him all along the way.
Yeah.
And a couple of times there's somebody who goes a long way with him. And the interpreters have a lot of trouble figuring out what's going on. And they aren't always sure the person even knows where they are. But there are at least some people who knew several regions in a row at least. So there probably were at least traders who would at least have part of the continent that they knew pretty well.
Yeah, and it seems to be kind of regionally specific, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not like, somebody, like you said, from North Carolina is going to be in California necessarily, or present-day North Carolina, present-day California. But, there are ways of kind of moving across. And I'm thinking, too, it always astonishes me kind of in pre-modernity, the distances that people would walk. Or it's sometimes if you had a horse, you could ride for a while or something like that. But it's still a really long distance to walk to Nebraska from Mexico.
Exactly. So, Right. Yeah, because Coronado had a horse, but his soldiers didn't.
No, they did not. So, or some trader, moving kind of goods from the Gulf of Mexico that wind up in Cahokia or, further north, right? Like so. And if I'm remembering correctly, right, like there's some evidence of kind of Cahokian civilization, like much further north in the kind of upper Midwest. As well, right?
Right. Yeah. So somebody's moving and talking. And that's one of the things I always ask my students is what can archaeology tell us and what can't it tell us? And like with those conversations, it's just like there must have been all kinds of conversations about whether to make a change or whether not to and what, besides even just more mundane things.
Yeah. And then kind of language issues, right? Because people are speaking different languges oftentimes.
Yeah.
So.
Right. There are, I always forget the number, but there are something like 9 different language families in North America. And so an uncountable number of different languages.
Yes, some of which, decipherable to others as within, but many of them not. So.
Many of them not at all.
Many of them not at all. That's right.
That's right. So again, when a European explorer would come, not only would he need a guide, but he also would have an interpreter. And then as he went farther, maybe a string of interpreters to try to get it back to Spanish or English or French or Dutch.
Yeah, I always think about, this is, something to do with kind of the Aztecs and kind of Cortez and stuff like that, is the process of translation that people have kind of figured out about Spanish into kind of Maya, into kind of this other Maya, into, kind of Nahuatl, and then kind of back. So there's like a string of 4 people kind of, and what's happening there and what is exactly being translated is always been kind of a question to me. All right, so cities kind of not disappear, but start to dissipate, right? Kind of in the as the Little Ice Age or the end of the medieval warm period, right? The kind of Little Ice Age, which is kind of 14th, 15th century and stuff like that. And so you have kind of a looser or maybe a more rural kind of population center across North America, and so that seems to be what most European Dutch, French colonists seem to encounter. Is that correct?
That's right. It's pretty town-based. So usually a town with farms surrounding it.
Okay. But does that seem to be the assumption that it's always been like that on the part of the European colonists?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. And also, they don't see it as primitive, right?
Sure.
Those villages don't look that much different from the villages I think that they're coming from. I mean, they find ways to, especially with Christianity, to see themselves as different, but it's not so much the material culture. So, yeah. Most of the ruins of the big cities are inland, and so explorers see them, but the settlers tend not to. They aren't going inland in these periods.
Yeah. And so it takes quite a while for historians to start to understand about the kind of myths that these settlers were kind of telling about this period and disambiguating kind of what was actually there in the past and what the stories the Europeans wanted people to understand about the past. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right.
And a lot of this is done because one of the things I'm genuinely curious about, because I don't work on this at all, is about oral histories. So like, how does that process work? Like, how do you work with oral histories, I guess would be kind of the question.
So I am trained as an ethnohistorian, and that was a movement of historians and anthropologists really to basically to put it at its most simple, to just say, like, we got to use all the sources we've got, and historians have to stop being so picky about only using documents, and anthropologists have to learn how to use documents for people who didn't write those documents themselves. So all of it is in the purpose of studying people who didn't leave written documents. And so oral history is part of that. So what I've done is use some oral histories were written down long ago. Some have been written down more recently and curated by Native nations today, Native historians today, and those are tremendously useful because they explain a lot more. They're probably more accurate. The 19th century ones they were written down by some 19th century non-Native person, and for the most part. Some of them were written down by, some of the Cherokee ones particularly are written down by Native people. But so there's that kind of oral history, and that is most of what I've been talking about for sort of looking back to this era of creating more democratic societies after the urban era. But there's also sort of tribal knowledge today and ways in which tribal historians today are telling their own histories, drawing on histories that they've kept in various ways, sometimes in written form, sometimes in oral form, and telling in books and articles and cultural centers and museums. And it's not quite the same as oral history, but it's equally valuable. And, I think as long as we get away from this idea that people of the present don't have anything to say about people of the past, tribes have been keeping their own histories for a long time. And this is a sort of era of renaissance in sort of linguistic and cultural revival within tribes and being able to publish more. And there are tribes that now have their own presses. There are museums and just websites run by many tribes that just sort of portray their history in a way that the rest of us can learn from. So I think without that kind of work, my book would be much thinner and much less responsible.
Yeah. No, and I was thinking about that too, as just kind of a way of kind of bringing it back to something we talked about right at the very beginning, is the importance of showing kind of continuity and that these Native peoples are still here, right? Is that these are sources that we can, and we do, historians do, as you do and as many others do, responsibly use in order to understand the past. It's not just kind of something you dig out of a musty archive.
That's right.
There's other ways of getting at kind of that truth about kind of what happened in the past.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. On that note, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. Go out and use all the sources you can do responsibly. If there's anything, there's probably other lessons, here, but I have a terrible short-term memory. So there we go. Kathleen, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really kind of lovely conversation. If people do want to learn more about you or your work, is there a way on the internet that they might be able to do so?
Yeah, probably the easiest is just my website, which is KathleenDuval.net. Duval with one L, Kathleen with a K. And you can get through that. You can get to all my stuff.
Fantastic. And your book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America, the Pulitzer Prize winning book, I should say. I just love saying that. Is available kind of everywhere in lovely paperback nowadays. And I'm sure ebook and audiobook and all sorts of stuff like that, of course. So go out and buy it, and I'm sure everybody will. So anyway, Kathleen, thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another episode of American Medieval. And until next week, be good or don't. I'm not your mom. So good luck to you. Okay. See you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.